What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you're listening to us or watching us today and you're thinking, the Catholic faith has something going for it, but there are these questions that I have. Well, we can answer those questions, and here is our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. If you're watching us on TV today, you can participate as well. Our email address is ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming there right now. Just put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see it. He'll send it to us here in the studio, and off we go. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
Got an interesting email here from someone named David, also David. He says, well, why am I not Catholic? Last month, you talked about being on the fence during your own conversion. Well, I feel super glued to that fence, and I don't feel like I have anybody that I can talk to or push me in the right direction like your wife did back in the day. Maybe I need to reach out to some Catholic folks to speak with. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. I can very much understand your dilemma and the being on the fence and like wanting to know what is the thing that's going to push me over the edge and really compel me to go. Well, yeah, believe it or not, that's one of the things that led me to EWTN so many years ago. I don't mean that led me to flip on the radio station. It led me to actually come out here physically to the campus. I live about 5 miles away, and I had called up the Coming Home Network and said, I need a real live breathing Catholic who used to be Protestant that I can talk to. And they put me in touch with somebody that worked at the network, and I came out here to engage. And but I had grown up in the Calvinist tradition and had this sort of idea in the back of the mind, really derived from Calvinism, that faith is it's just a thing that happens to you. Kind of comes at you like a flash of inspiration. It's a work of divine providence, and my own agency in the matter really doesn't matter, or is secondary at best. And while the Catholic Church does teach that faith is a gift, it also teaches that faith is very much a human act. It doesn't just come to you out of nowhere. It is a decision. It's an act of the will commanding the intellect to assent to divine revelation. And that means that you can sit on the fence forever until you make the decision to believe. Now, you say, how can I just decide to believe? Well, you don't decide something in a vacuum, but there is a moral component to the act of faith in the same way that I make a decision to believe my wife if she tells me something that I can't independently verify. My wife says, for example, I've got to go to this meeting on Thursday and I need you to pick up the kid from school. I don't say, wait, let me see if I can prove that out of the philosophy books. And, what do the geology textbooks say about that? At some point, I have to just rely on her testimony.
Of course.
And that's the morally appropriate thing to do, because that's what being in relationship with a trustworthy person is about. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, at some point, you have to just make the decision to entrust yourself to the Catholic way of life because you know that it's good. And rely on the representations, the testimony of the Church, because she's reliable. And what's the benefit? What's the payoff for doing that? Well, you get to live the Catholic way of life that is transformative and transcendent and promises eternal life as a reward, and evidences the saints in proof of its claims. Right? It really does make you holy and change you if you live it generously and faithfully. And you see that's evident to you, and you have to say, I'm tired of being outside. I want to get on the inside into the family of God that's the Catholic faith and to actually live the thing. But to do that, I've got to choose to get off the fence. Would it help you to talk to real Catholics? Probably, but some real Catholics are more helpful than others.
True. So keep listening to EWTN.
Yep.
All right. David, thank you so much for your email. Here's another one now from Dolores. What does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? How are we like him?
Yeah, thanks. So the traditional Catholic teaching here is that we're like God, all of us, insofar as we're rational. We have the capacity to deliberate morally about our actions, and we can choose based on that deliberation, that freedom and that rationality and that ability to anticipate the results of our actions and to evaluate things according to their moral good or their transcendent good. That's what makes us made in God's likeness and image. Now, we have a problem, and that is that this nature that God has given us is both an endowment, it's a gift, but it's also a kind of an obligation. There's an achievement. There's something to be achieved in living this rational, moral life that most of us fall short of. We have various problems in our affections, in our emotional life, and even in our cognitive life that detract us from the true, the good, and the beautiful. That needs to be healed. That's what we call the wounds of original sin. They need to be healed within us. And so the teaching of the Church is that through Christ, we regain what we somewhat lost in Adam, which is this being made in God's likeness and image. We're reformed after the image of Christ so that we become perfectly what we already are.
Okay. Well, very good. And thank you so much, Dolores, for your email. It was a good one. If you have a question you'd like to ask via email, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. On each of our programs, our live shows, that is, we try to answer 2 or 3 emails in every show, and then once a month or so we'll pull out the mailbag and answer a whole passel of emails. So on one way or the other, we'll hopefully get your question answered. However, today we are going to the phones, and we'll be doing that in just a moment here. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. And again, if you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. Back in a moment, we'll be talking with Nick in Detroit, also Brenda in Texas. Lots more to go here on this edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us. Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Nick in Detroit, listening to us on YouTube today. Hey, Nick, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how's it going? So the Bible appears to say both about judgment, where we are not to judge at all, and then on the other hand, it says you can judge, but judge righteously. And I've seen both sides of the fence here, Catholics, where those on the left, they say we are not to judge, so they welcome everything and everybody. And then on the right, you see proudly they condemn all this, that we can judge righteously, so they proudly condemn, all acts of whatever, homosexuality and lukewarm Catholics. And so the question is, what are we to judge at all, and what is the correct way to judge?
Yeah, thanks. What a great question. So I've seen what you're talking about, but I think that it is both sides of the ideological divide are selective in the way they judge. And so you'll often hear from people on the left, for example, well, you shouldn't be judgmental, but then they have a lot of very judgmental things to say about those that contravene their various convictions about, say, social justice, the way they define those terms, right? And you might hear people on the right say, well, we really have to pass judgment on these sexual sins, and yet become strangely quiet when members of their own sect, members of their own group, are found to have, maybe, dipped their hand in the offering basket or some other transgression, but it doesn't fall within the ideological parameters that would call for censure, and they want to kind of rally the troops and protect their own. So, and this is what the bishops got in trouble for, actually, when it came to the sex abuse crisis, was covering up and this kind of business. So I think you find selective judgment on each side, and they tend to judge in ways that reinforce their own sort of tribal identities and their ideological preferences. There's a book by a psychologist named Keith Stanovich called The Bias That Divides Us, and it is about what he has called my side bias. It's the tendency that we have to prefer our group to the other guys and to impute the worst possible motives to the other fellows. And he has an experiment that he describes in there that I think is utterly fascinating. I'd like to tell you about. Some researchers did an experiment where they took a scene of political protest, political activism, where there were a group of protesters that were, upset about something, and the cops were roughing them up a bit. Okay. And what they did is they showed this video to two different groups, and they told them two different stories about who was being roughed up. So one group was told, these are liberal activists that are protesting the military exclusion on gays in the military. They had told the other group, well, this is a group of pro-life protesters that are protesting abortion. And then they looked to see how did the subjects in the experiment evaluate whether or not the protesters' civil rights were violated. And what they found was, if you were in the predictable political party, if you were ideologically aligned with the pro-life movement, then you heard the pro-life story, then you thought, oh, their civil rights are absolutely being transgressed. But if you were on the other side of the aisle and you heard the pro-life story, you said, oh, no, this police violence here was totally justified. But the judgment was reversed in the other situation. So the pro-life people who also tend to, be more tolerant of exclusion from gays from the military, for example, would say, oh, this was perfectly reasonable use of police force. In the same way, the sort of more left-leaning people would say, oh, it's totally reasonable for them to use force against the pro-life people. So it all depended on who you thought was being persecuted as to how you formed the judgment. Now, my takeaway from all of that, and this goes to the depths of your question, is how actually do we judge? What does it mean to judge rightly? Right? Well, I think it means being keenly aware, among other things, of our capacity for self-deception, for delusion, to the way I can let my own ideological preferences or my own agenda influence my judgment. And that's very difficult to do, and it requires not an ideological commitment, but a tremendous amount of justice and charity, an awful lot of virtue to be able to form a just judgment. And that's not something that can be taught in an ethics classroom. That's not something that I can learn even by reading the catechism. I can learn the right dogmatic formula. I can learn the right propositions to affirm. That doesn't mean that I will do a good job of implementing them in the warp and woof of daily life unless I've really genuinely learned to die to myself. That's why I think Jesus tells us, take the log out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of your neighbor's, because it's so easy to deflect attention from my own failures if I'm caught up in the ideological battle and I equate my Christian discipleship, say, with political activism, wherever that activism is lodged, whether on the right or the left. It's not about that. It's about I need to be personally transformed into the likeness and image of Jesus, have that compassion and that clarity of vision whereby I really can pass a right judgment. And my judgment is not to support an ideological position. It's really aimed at the integral good of another human being.
Sure.
And so when am I capable of sitting with somebody on the other side of the political aisle from me and being genuinely open to their self-revelation, to hear what that person is saying, to listen to them, to treat them as a human being, not intent on imposing an agenda, but intent on actually understanding with empathy if I can do that, and that's what Christ did with the sinners and the tax collectors and all the rest of it. He went and ate with these people, spent time with them, loved on them. Right? Then he was in a position to offer a challenging moral teaching, but only after he had proved through charity that he was credible and trustworthy.
Nick, we hope that's helpful for you. Thank you so much for your call. Great way to start the show. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go now to Brenda in Irving, Texas, listening on the great Guadalupe Radio, AM 910. Brenda, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. D. Hi, Dr. Anders.
Hi.
My question is, are there any specific sins that are related to the wounds of Christ? So, like, say, the crown of thorns he wore on his head, does that mean, are those sins of the mind? The wounds of the feet? I don't know. Are they any sins that are related in relation to? Do they mean anything?
Sure. Yeah, I understand the question. So, the way Catholic exegetes, biblical interpreters, have treated these kinds of things over the centuries is, number one, absolutely defined these kinds of associations. So I can't pull one out of the top of my head, but I guarantee you that someplace in the commentary tradition, there's some Catholic somewhere who has drawn out symbols from the wounds of Christ in exactly the way that you have described.
Okay.
But I feel equally confident that some other interpreter has come up with a completely different list of symbols, right? And so I don't think it's wrong at all for you to approach the wounds of Christ in this way, but I think that this kind of association is open to your own free elaboration. And so, for example, the image that you gave me, when I think about the crown of thorns on Christ's head, it calls to mind my own sins of the mind. Well, I mean, you just taught me something, Brenda. That's brilliant. Wonderful. So if that reflection moves you to deeper piety and contrition and love for God, then I'd say go for it, regardless of what someone else in the tradition has reflected on about the crucifixion of Jesus. These kinds of images and associations, I think, come to us spontaneously all the time. As we engage with the different aspects of the tradition. And that's the thing about symbols. A symbol is richer than a sign. A stop sign has pretty much one unambiguous meaning.
Yeah.
Stop, right?
Stop.
But a symbol draws in so many more dimensions. It's a richer way of connecting to realities, and it's really open to a kind of free elaboration that knows no bounds. And so, whatever engagement with the images of the faith will move you to faith, hope, and charity, go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Brenda, thank you so much for your question. It is a Call to Communion here on EWTN with Dr. David Anders. If you have a question for us, or if you'd like to tell us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic, the way our first emailer did, do give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here is Phil now in Oklahoma, listening on, Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey, Phil, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I called a few weeks ago about the book of John, and the doctor agreed with me that it is a book of signs and symbols, but I didn't get the second part of my question. So my second part of the question was, did the wedding at Cana actually happen, and the woman at the well, did that actually happen, or those symbols?
Okay, yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So I do think that the way you have framed it presents a false dichotomy. That is to say, either these are historical episodes or they are symbols. And when St. Thomas Aquinas, who's the common doctor of the Catholic Church, talks about allegory as a literary form in the Scriptures, Thomas says, look, human writers can use foreshadowing and symbolology and allegory. They can use these literary techniques in their works. God can too, with this added benefit. He can write the symbols into the historical narrative. If God is the Lord of history, and he knows that the sacred history of the people of God, people of Israel, will be recounted later in literature, God is capable of working the symbolic associations into the actual historical events themselves, as well as into the literary depiction of those historical episodes. So there's nothing preventing them from being both historical episodes and from being literary symbols. Now, when it comes to the question of the Gospel of John, scholars are really kind of all over the place on the interpretation of John. I mean, I have read fairly skeptical, critical scholars who are not practicing Christians who believe that there are elements of John's Gospel that, from their point of view, are closer to the historical reality than elements in the synoptics. I've heard the opposite point of view defended. And so my answer to the question personally would be, I don't know. Like when it actually comes to the sequence of Jesus's events in Christ's life, and with these Polaroid snapshots, I can't answer that question. I do know that the point of the text is to present a luminous spiritual truth to me in the form of a narrative that has the capacity to transform. And the books, the symbols and signs in John are particularly rich in significance. Church fathers, for example, you mentioned the woman at the well, universally see her as an allegory for the Gentile church. Right? Now, was there an actual historical woman at the well in Samaria? I wasn't there. I would suspect so. But at the end of the day, the significance is less on the particular details of Christ's chronology and more on the spiritual sign that's meant to transform me in the same way that the woman in the narrative is transformed.
Very good. And Phil, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Isidro in Atlanta, listening on our great station there, The Quest. Isidro, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you guys doing? Thanks for taking my call. So basically my question is, like, when something bad happens, like when, say, a teenager commits suicide or when a father kills their child or something, is God in control?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So to answer this question in any way, shape, form, or fashion, yes or no, absolutely fails to do justice to the horrific psychological and existential crisis that a person would experience in such a situation. I am going to answer the question, yes, that God is in control, because that's the teaching of the Catholic faith, but recognizing that a lot more needs to be said. A lot more needs to be said in order to make that answer pastorally useful. And the evident conflict, the contrast, the paradox of a loving God in control of a world with horrific evil is the subject of a lot of biblical literature. The book of Job, of course, is probably the most prominent example. And it is telling that at the end of the book of Job, Job's companions have sought to give a rational account of God's justice in the face of evil. They've all offered a theodicy, that's the technical word for it, an explanation for why Job is getting his just deserts, or, this all makes sense in God's providence. And Job's response is to say, I ain't done nothing wrong, and God has totally not shown up, and I'm really upset about it. That's Job's response. And when God finally shows up at the end of the book, he says, Job is righteous, you guys are not. He condemns his defenders and vindicates his accuser. And what's my takeaway from that? That when I am sitting with a suffering person, the last thing in the world I want to give them is, hey, I've got the explanation. Let me tell you why you're hurting. I don't want to do that. Rather, I want to be with them, show them compassion, to suffer alongside them, which is what Christ does for me, and to manifest rather than simply talk about the goodness of God.
Isidro, thank you so much for your call. Glad that you're listening there on The Quest, one of our very important radio partners here at EWTN. In a moment, we're going to get back to the phones, and let me give you that number one more time, 833-288-EWTN. We're just at the halfway point here. Love to hear from you at 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Do stay with us. Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here's an email from an anonymous listener who says, how can you refute someone who states that since the Bible was wrong when it ordered the stoning of adulterers, that would be Deuteronomy 22, verses 22 through 24, it may be wrong on other teachings as well, and especially teachings on sexual morality. And there they're quoting 1 Corinthians 6:9.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So you would have to take the Bible like a fundamentalist does for this to present the kind of problem that you're suggesting. And what I mean by that is the fundamentalist takes each of the propositions found in sacred scripture in a kind of woodenly literal and even-handed way, suggesting that their significance to us, their meaning to us, is just what the denotative structure of the sentence conveys as the man on the street would understand it. Period, end of paragraph, with no nuance. And that's never been the way the Catholic Church has read the Bible. It's not the way Jesus read the Bible. And so the position of the New Testament on the Old Testament is that the Old Testament Mosaic law is a kind of concession with a sort of historical relativity built into it, the purpose of which is to guide the people of God, especially Israel, to the coming of the Messiah, in whom the fullness of God's revelation is made manifest. And now it is not the written law composed on tablets of stone. It is the new law, summed up in the twin commandments of loving God and loving neighbor, that is written on the heart, that is ultimately conveyed by Christ. And there is no subsequent revelation. You can't get better than God in the flesh and the love of God and neighbor as the ethic defining your life. That's the sum total of man's religious aspiration. And when it comes to the specific details of the law, what does it actually mean in real time to love God and to love your neighbor? Well, loving my neighbor means not that I follow a list of prescriptions derived from the Old Testament, but that I seek my neighbor's genuine integral good. Meaning, I have to actually really know what a human being is. I have to really know what my neighbor is. And I need charity to do that because I have to really care. But I need a lot of wisdom, need a lot of prudence. I may need scientific investigation, may need philosophy, may need all kinds of tools really to get at the question of what is the integral good of my neighbor. And the Catholic position, and I won't go into great detail and defend this now because I'm running a bit long, but it's essentially that there are specifics that we can know about the integral good of a human person from rational, scientific, philosophical analysis, and that is ultimately what's compelling to us. Now, when you talk about the human sexuality thing, this is not determinative, but it's suggested, and I'll just throw this out there. There's a sociologist by the name of Mark Regnerus who published a study several years ago called the New Family Structure Study that evaluated the outcome on children of being raised in a traditional two-parent male-female home versus some of the more fashionable alternatives. And essentially what Regnerus found was that, lo and behold, kids do better when they are raised, all things being equal, and sometimes they're not equal, right? But all things being equal, in the generality of cases, children do better when they're raised by their biological parents, who, by the way, in case you missed this, will necessarily, by a kind of a biological demand, be a man and a woman.
Sure.
And so there are ethical conclusions that you can draw from that kind of research. And that's just one domain of scholarship. That's just sociology. But there are things like, okay, well, all things being equal, the welfare of families and children is better served by supporting the integrity and the dignity of men and women having babies. Go figure.
Absolutely. Appreciate that. And thank you so much for your email. Back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Angel in Baton Rouge, listening on iHeartRadio. Angel, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I have a question I think Mr. Anders can help me with. My son attended a Presbyterian service yesterday, and he brought home they had like a little bulletin they handed out, the liturgy that they celebrated, and they recited the Apostles' Creed. And of course, in the Apostles' Creed, it states, "I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints," and it's printed here. I'm looking at it in this little handout. But my question is, how can they say the Apostles' Creed when they don't believe in apostolic succession? And how can they believe in the Holy Catholic Church when they're Presbyterian?
Yes, thank you so much. Great questions, both of these. So the reformers of the 16th century, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Cranmer, Zwingli, and a lot of them, those that gave us Protestantism, were very keenly aware of this problem. And they did not want to claim that they were breaking away from the one church and forming a new one, because that would be laughable on the face of it. I mean, like, who wants to say, I'm breaking away from the church that Christ founded, I'm starting my own, right? No one wants to say that. Luther hated it when people called his movement Lutheranism, because he recognized that in one fell swoop undercut what he was claiming, namely to have restored rather than to have innovated, right? And so they all wanted to claim the mantle of continuity with Christian antiquity. They wanted to see themselves as being continuous with the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of the first 4 centuries. Now, they gave a different account of the continuity. See, in Catholic tradition, we understand the doctrine of apostolic succession. They had to reject that. They had to reject that because they didn't have it. None of them had apostolic succession, so they couldn't make their claim to authority rest on that. And so what they claimed instead was, it's not the succession from the apostles that validates our ministry, it's the doctrine of the apostles that we've recovered. That's the way they argued.
Okay.
Occasionally, they would claim more. They would claim a kind of prophetic inspiration, a sort of a direct vocation from God. The other reformers definitely talked about Luther in that way. Some of Calvin's contemporaries talked about Calvin in that way. Calvin himself, in a number of sermons, would use that kind of language about himself. He thought he had a kind of divine vocation, call on his life to preach apostolic doctrine, and he was this apostolic figure, not in virtue of the laying on of hands, but in virtue of this sort of private, subjective endowment that God had given him. And so they, and there in a few places, they even sort of tease around a kind of doctrine of apostolic succession. Interestingly, once they felt like they had restored the church to its integral purity, they were much keener on a doctrine of ordination. All right, so you find in Calvin, for example, in the early Calvin of, say, 1535, 36, he's much less insistent on ordination as a qualification for ministry. Why? He wasn't ordained. That's why, right? But as you move into the 1540s and the 1550s, Calvin becomes much more insistent that only a validly ordained ministry can take up the ministry of the Word. A validly ordained minister can take up the ministry of the Word. Interestingly, in the period after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in France, this is when Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Nantes, which was an edict of toleration of Protestants. I think this is 1685. And he said, well, there are no Protestants left in France, so we don't need this edict anymore. Protestantism is now illegal in France. There was a group of Protestants in the Cévennes region of southern France that up in the mountains that held out against that decree and sort of went into this rebellion mode, and they had a lot of charismatic displays and speaking in tongues and claims to prophecy and this kind of thing. And there was a fellow by the name of Antoine Cour who didn't like all the charismatic hoopla, and he wanted to restore the Reformed or Presbyterian church to what he thought of was sort of decency and order. And interestingly, to do this would have been late 17th century. He travels to Geneva, the home of Calvin, to receive ordination, the laying on of hands from the Calvinist ministry.
Okay.
And then on the strength of that, he goes back into the Cévennes and claims, you see what I'm saying? Like a kind of quasi-apostolic succession.
Wow.
In order to whip the French prophets into shape and get them back into ecclesiastical discipline. So all that's a very long answer to your question, but like they know that they need a kind of apostolic authority. And they've kind of waffled back and forth between a sort of weak embrace of apostolic succession, all of which is motivated by polemical necessity, because they can't admit we broke away. Because as soon as you say we broke away, then you've given up the whole game.
Yeah.
And why do I want to follow, like the Church of Calvin? I don't want the Church of Calvin. I want the Church of Jesus. How do we know what that is? And the truth of the matter is what led me out of Calvinism was it wasn't just their spurious claim to succession. It was their doctrine.
Of course.
Because the whole thing lands on this question of, hey, we're the guys that recovered apostolic doctrine. No, you didn't. Go read the 2nd century fathers. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. The doctrine and the authority and the succession and the sacraments of the apostles continues within the one, the holy, the one and only Holy Catholic Church.
We're big believers in both and, aren't we?
Both and.
Definitely. Angel, thanks so much for your call. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. I'd like to take a moment here to say a few words about EWTN's National Catholic Register. It's America's most trusted Catholic news source with a comprehensive view of the world from a Catholic perspective. You can give a gift subscription or subscribe for yourself and save up to 42%. Visit ncregister.com today. ncregister.com. Right now, you can also receive daily, weekly, or alert emails from the Register. No charge for that. Visit EWTN.com, click on the word subscribe. You'll see a menu of things that you can subscribe to. Choose the Register, and you are good to go. Back to the phones now here on Call to Communion on EWTN. Here is William in Atlanta, listening on The Quest. Hey, William, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, sir. I have a question here from a friend that basically the body is separate from the soul. Like they're two completely different things, and our bodies are basically just shells or vessels. And I'm pretty sure that's not true in the Catholic Church, and I don't know how to find the answer.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So, in the call screener's description of your problem, I may have misread it, but I think there was maybe a hint of whether or not there's an exegetical solution to this problem. Can we find something in Scripture that would settle that? Maybe in the Corinthian correspondence. Maybe I read that wrong, but I think maybe it's where we're going.
I think so.
And I'd like to say at the outset, that's not the way to solve it.
Right?
That the sacred Scripture is not given to us so that we can deduce from the pages of the Bible a fully worked out philosophical anthropology. And I don't think that's too difficult to claim to substantiate. I mean, go read the Bible. Does it read like a philosophical treatise on the nature of the soul from Aristotle? Not at all.
No.
I mean, these are occasional texts that are usually exhorting people about particular moral matters. They're not given in that way. So that's not the way to solve the problem. And historically, the Catholic Church hasn't looked at it that way. It said, look, we want a good understanding of the nature of the human person. And yes, we have reference to divine revelation, but we have to flesh that out with philosophical and scientific analysis. And there's a lot of problems with a purely dualistic account of the relation of soul to body, like the Cartesian view. There's a lot of problems. The biggest one in philosophy is what's called the interaction problem, right? If body and soul are radically distinct, sort of ontological entities, then how the heck do they communicate? I mean, Descartes thought it was through the pineal gland, but I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. And the more we learn about human cognition, the more we see that Descartes' position is absolutely untenable, right? That we don't know purely rationalistically in a vacuum from empirical experience. Our knowledge is very, very much embodied and embedded in the physical and natural and social worlds. And since our analysis of the soul and all our affectivity and our decision-making and all of that is where the relevance of this doctrine comes in. You have to take account of all that embodied, embedded physical stuff to give an account of how is it that our cognition and our affectivity and our decision-making actually function in real time. And 200 years of 2,000 years of philosophy and a good 60 years of hard cognitive science all count much against the Cartesian view. So the classical Catholic view and you alluded to this with the call screen, of course, is hylomorphism, right? Which is that the soul is what we mean by the kind of structural functional organization that gives a unitary coherence to the human person and makes him into the kind of rational thing that he is, but not to be conceived of as, the ectoplasmic toothpaste inside the toothpaste tube.
Okay. And William, thanks so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Got a call from Gene in Wyoming. Gene says, where does the Church of Latter-day Saints fall in with apostolic succession? And what are their thoughts on Jesus?
Yes. So they do not possess apostolic succession. And if there is a way to intensify an absolute negative, I would say they really, 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 really don't possess. Underline. Really don't possess apostolic succession.
Okay.
Interestingly, they don't claim to. Not in the way that Catholics understand the term. The Latter-day Saints' position is that apostolic succession ceased, that it was utterly eradicated with the death of the last apostle. They are radical primitivists, radical restorationists in this regard. They think that there was a dearth of apostolic revelation and authority, an absolute absence of it for 1900 years, until Joseph Smith dug it out of a hillside in upstate New York. And so theirs is not so much a doctrine of apostolic succession as a doctrine of apostolic destruction and reinstitution. Now, from a Catholic point of view, and just from an historical point of view, that claim is wildly fantastical and wholly incredible. Because the Mormons teach all kinds of things about history that are manifestly false. Most evident is Smith's claim that Native Americans were descended from the 12 tribes of Israel. And we know from archaeology and DNA evidence that Native Americans have been on the continent for something like 15,000 years, long before Abraham, and are in no way descended from ancient Semites.
So there that is. And the other question, what are their thoughts on Jesus?
Oh, yes. He's the biological son of a human father that they call God, who had, by some sort of apotheosis, became divinized in the manner of Greek mythology, not the way the Catholic Church understands God. And his brother is Satan. So those are things that the Mormons believe about Jesus.
Well, there that is. Gene?
By the way,
yes.
Catholics don't believe any of what I just said.
Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate that. Gene in Wyoming, thanks for your call today. Here is Pamela, a first-time caller from Dallas, listening today on YouTube. Hey, Pamela, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. I wanted to ask, is it licit or valid for my cousin to attend a SSPX Mass? And I want to understand the difference between licit and valid.
Okay, thanks. So valid is not a word that we need to use one way or the other with respect to your cousin's participation, right? Because the question of validity would only come in regarding the celebration of the sacraments, whether or not the Mass celebrated by a priest of the society is valid or not, right? We wouldn't talk about a communicant's participation as valid or not. We would talk about the celebration of the Mass is valid. Now, what the Church has said is that the sacraments of the SSPX are valid. They are valid. Their Mass is valid. Their ordinations are valid. Up until recently, their sacrament of reconciliation was not valid. Up until recently. The reason why is that for the validity of reconciliation, you need proper jurisdiction. You need to have a bishop who can authorize you, who has jurisdiction over a diocese, and can give you jurisdiction, can give you faculties to celebrate the sacrament. In the absence of those faculties, celebration of the sacrament is not valid. And they don't have, their bishops have no jurisdiction because they have no diocese. So they're bizarre. Someone once compared the bishops of the society to husbands without wives.
Yeah.
It's a kind
How
of
does
paradox,
this compute? Yeah.
I mean, a bishop is always tied to a geographic jurisdiction.
Sure.
Right? They don't have them. They can't give faculties for a jurisdiction that doesn't exist. Now, because there have been enough generations have passed, enough kids have grown up attending the chapels of the society, and they know no other expression of the Catholic faith, out of solicitude, out of pastoral care for those souls, Pope Francis, in an extraordinary act of benevolence and condescension, said, you know what, I'm going to unilaterally grant faculties to the priests of the society so that they can validly hear confessions. But this grant of faculties is from the Pope, right, not from their own bishops. They also did not have jurisdiction to validly celebrate Catholic weddings for the same reason, right? And so a Catholic who married in one of their ceremonies would not actually have a valid marriage because it wouldn't be according to canonical form. And same thing, Pope said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to selectively allow the bishops of the society the priests of the society to celebrate marriages, provided the valid Catholic bishop in their jurisdiction consents.
Oh.
And so there's some, wiggle room in there. Now, licit would mean not, does the sacrament work, but do you have permission to do it? And it is the question of liceity that lies at the heart of the whole thing, not validity. When Archbishop Lefebvre, he had the sacramental power to validly ordain other bishops, but Pope John Paul II said, don't you do it. You do not have permission. It is not licit. And he went and did it anyway. So he did an act that was sacramentally valid, but against the express command of the Pope and therefore illicit. And for that act of disobedience, he was excommunicated. Now, subsequently, the popes have lifted that degree of excommunication, but they exist now in a sort of canonical no man's land where they are not in obedience to the Pope and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But because of various grants on the part of the papacy, they can have valid sacraments. Now, I think a better question for your cousin is about the prudence of attending such things, right? Rather than the question of validity. And, St. Paul makes it clear that the most Catholic thing that you can do is be in communion, not to pull apart into sects, into your own little group or party apart. And where Peter is, there is the church. And so I think that the expression of Catholic unity, for my judgment, prudently demands the most visible union with the Pope of Rome.
Pamela, is that helpful for you?
Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your call. We'll close out with this email from Angela. Very interesting. Can you please comment on what type of work is to be avoided on the Sabbath day in order to honor the Lord's Day? I would like to understand what it is we are not to do as considered work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the question. So, of course, when you read the Sabbath commandment, one of the key issues there is granting rest to your employees, to your servants, right? And why is that? Well, we want for people to have the opportunity to celebrate the Lord's Day and to spend time with their families and to refresh themselves in the love of God and neighbor. And so work that would detract from those primary aims would be counterindicated. Now, we're not Jews, and we don't have the kind of sort of nitpicking, pedantic, detailed Sabbath legislation that would be characteristic of a lot of Jewish experience. And by using that language, I don't mean any disrespect to the tradition. That's just the way they conceptualize it differently than we do.
Right.
So as Christ said, there's Sabbath is the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? And so there's a kind of liberality and charity and prudence allowable, and there are exceptions. I mean, some people have no choice but to work on the Sabbath because they have to do so to support their families or whatever it might be, or you emergency worker or EMT or something, obviously, in service to the common good, you may have to do something. But if you're worried about basting the turkey, don't worry about that. That's fine.
Very good. And we'll we have time for one more here. This is from an anonymous listener. I'm reading a book about St. Margaret Mary. She talks about making acts of reparation for sinners. Could you please elaborate on what this means and if making personal sacrifices like fasting could be one of those acts of reparation?
It sure could be. So St. Paul says in the book of Colossians that he fills up in his own flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. The church has a long tradition of teaching that by my prayers and sacrifices and sufferings that I can that can be of benefit not only to my own soul but to other souls as well. God tells Abraham, I'll spare the wicked for the sake of the righteous. Right? This is a deeply biblical principle. And so, yes, I mean, any act of penance that you perform can be edifying in your own case, but can also have spiritual benefits for the wider body of Christ.
So there you go. Anonymous, thank you so much for your email. And by the way, if you would like to send us an email for a future show, that email box is always open for you, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Fast-moving show today. Dr. David Anders, thank you.
Tom.
Appreciate that. On the radio side of EWTN, we do this program Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern for the live show, and then we encore that at 11 p.m. Eastern, which, of course, 8 p.m. on the West Coast. You can check out the podcast anytime you wish. Our producer, Charles, will have that posted for you in a few hours here at EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our fantastic team and all of our wonderful listeners, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Hey, thanks for joining us. See you next time here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.